In 1954, a small Central American country held the answer to one of the most disturbing questions in modern history. What happens when a democratically elected government tries to take back land from a corporation? And that corporation happens to have the CIA on speed dial. The country was Guatemala. The corporation was the United Fruit Company. And the operation that followed, codenamed PB Success, would overthrow a sitting president, install a military dictator, and set off a 36-year civil war that killed an estimated 200,000 people, all to protect banana profits. And the thing is, this wasn't some rogue operation carried out in the shadows by a few overzealous agents. This was sanctioned at the highest levels of the American government, planned methodically over months, and executed with the full weight of the most powerful intelligence apparatus on Earth. The men who authorized it held titles like Secretary of State and Director of the CIA. And both of them, as it turns out, had once been on the payroll of the very company they were protecting. This is a story about fruit, about empire, about propaganda so effective it made an entire nation believe a lie. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story about how the border between corporate interest and national security was erased so completely that even the people pulling the strings could not tell the difference anymore. So let me take you back long before the coup, long before the Cold War fears and the covert flights out of Nicaragua. Let me take you back to a time when Guatemala was not yet a country. It was a product. To understand why the CIA overthrew a democracy to save a fruit company, you first have to understand what Guatemala looked like before any of this happened. And for most of its modern history, Guatemala was a country defined by a single brutal equation. Land equals power, and power belongs to whoever controls the land. For centuries, that control rested with a tiny elite, a handful of families and foreign interests who treated the country's soil as their personal estate. The vast majority of Guatemala's population, most of them indigenous Maya, worked the land but owned almost none of it. By the early 20th century, roughly 2% of the population controlled 72% of the country's arable land. Meanwhile, 88% of the people held just 14%. This was not a quirk of economics, it was by design. Enter the United Fruit Company. The company first arrived in Guatemala in 1901 during the reign of the dictator Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who granted it enormous concessions: land, railroad rights, control of the postal service, and later the country's telegraph and telephone systems. These were not fair negotiations between equals, they were transactions between a desperate autocrat who needed foreign investment to keep his grip on power, and a company more than willing to exploit that desperation. In exchange for building infrastructure, the United Fruit Company received 99-year leases on vast tracts of the most fertile land in the country. Tax exemptions that ensured virtually nothing went back to the Guatemalan people. And total control over the country's only railroad in its most viable international port. And then came Jorge Ubico. In 1931, General Jorge Ubico rose to the presidency in an election where he was the only candidate on the ballot. Ubico, who once compared himself favorably to Adolf Hitler, ruled Guatemala with an iron fist for 13 years. He was exactly the kind of leader the United Fruit Company loved. Under Ubico, the company expanded its control to over 42% of Guatemala's total landmass. It paid almost nothing in taxes. It paid almost nothing in import duties. Its workers, many of them indigenous Mayans, forced into labor through vagrancy laws that Ubico himself had passed, earned next to nothing. The company's plantations operated like feudal estates. Workers lived in company housing, bought from company stores, and had no right to organize, no right to strike, and no recourse when conditions became unbearable. Guatemala was, by every definition, what critics had begun calling a banana republic. A country whose entire economy, politics, and sovereignty had been subordinated to the interests of a single foreign corporation. And here is the detail that makes all of this even more grotesque. The United Fruit Company did not even use most of the land it controlled. Roughly 85% of its holdings in Guatemala sat idle, uncultivated, untouched. The company kept this land idle deliberately. By controlling the supply of available farmland, they could suppress competition, keep banana prices high, and maintain their monopoly. Hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans went hungry on land they could have farmed. Land that sat empty because a company in Boston decided it was more profitable that way. The United Fruit Company was not just an employer or an investor. It was, in the words of one historian, a state within the Guatemalan state. It owned the railroads, it owned the ports, it owned the telephone lines, it owned the land. And critically, it owned the political class. What it did not yet own, at least not formally, was the CIA. But that relationship was coming. Everything changed in 1944. After 13 years of Ubico's dictatorship, the Guatemalan people had finally had enough. A wave of popular protests swept through the country, led by students, teachers, professionals, and military officers who were disgusted by the corruption and repression. Ubico was forced to resign, and for the first time in Guatemala's history, the country held what many considered a genuinely free and democratic election. The winner was Juan José Arévalo, a philosopher and educator who had been living in exile in Argentina. Arévalo won with an overwhelming majority, and he immediately set about transforming Guatemala. He built over 6,000 schools. He established a social security program. He created labor protections that for the first time gave workers the right to organize and the right to strike. He passed a new constitution, modeled ironically on that of the United States. The period that followed became known as the 10 Years of Spring, a brief window of democratic reform and social progress that Guatemala had never experienced before, and tragically would not experience again for decades. But Arévalo's reforms were cautious. He expanded education and healthcare. He gave workers basic rights. But he largely avoided the most explosive issue in Guatemalan society: land. He knew that touching the land question meant touching the United Fruit Company, and touching the United Fruit Company meant touching the United States. So he moved carefully, building the foundation for deeper reform without directly confronting the corporation. The confrontation would fall to his successor. In 1951, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz Guzman won Guatemala's presidential election in a landslide. Arbenz was a military man, but he was also a reformer who had witnessed firsthand the devastating inequality that defined his country. He understood that in a nation where the overwhelming majority of the population depended on agriculture, and where a tiny elite and a foreign corporation controlled nearly all of the farmable land, no amount of school building or social programs could address the root cause of poverty. The land had to be redistributed. And so in June of 1952, Arbenz got the Guatemalan Congress to pass what became known as Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law. The law was simple in its logic and modest in its scope. It targeted only uncultivated land on estates larger than 223 acres. If a large landowner was actively farming all of their property, the law did not touch them. But if they were sitting on vast tracts of idle land while peasants starved, the government would expropriate the unused portion, compensate the owner with government bonds, and redistribute the land to impoverished agricultural workers. Over the course of roughly 18 months, the law redistributed over 600,000 hectares to approximately 100,000 families, roughly 500,000 individuals, about 1/6 of the entire country's population. The majority of those who benefited were indigenous Mayan communities whose ancestors had been dispossessed since the Spanish conquest. Arbenz was not trying to build a communist state. He was trying to build a capitalist one. His stated goal was to transform Guatemala from a pseudo-feudal economy into a modern, competitive capitalist nation. He wanted to break the stranglehold of monopoly land ownership, create a class of independent small farmers, and generate the kind of broad-based economic activity that would lift the country out of poverty. He also pushed for the construction of a national highway that would break the United Fruit Company's transportation monopoly, a new port on the Atlantic coast that would end the company's control over Guatemala's access to international shipping, and a hydroelectric plant that would reduce the country's dependence on foreign energy companies. And this is precisely what made Arbenz so dangerous, not to Guatemala, but to the United Fruit Company. Because when the agrarian reform law came for the United Fruit Company's land, the numbers told a damning story. In 1953, the Arbenz government announced that it would expropriate approximately 234,000 acres of the company's uncultivated holdings. The government offered compensation of $1.2 million, a figure based on the value that the company itself had declared on its own tax filings. This is important. The United Fruit Company had been systematically undervaluing its land for years to minimize its tax obligations to Guatemala. They had told the Guatemalan government their land was worth very little, and now the Guatemalan government was taking them at their word. The company was furious. United Fruit and the US State Department countered with the demand for $16 million, more than 13 times what the company's own accountants had claimed the land was worth. When Arbenz refused to pay an inflated price for land the company had deliberately devalued, the machinery of regime change began to turn. Now, to understand why the United States government was willing to overthrow a democracy to protect a fruit company, you need to understand the extraordinary web of personal and financial connections that linked the United Fruit Company to the highest levels of the Eisenhower administration. Because this was not a case where a corporation lobbied the government and the government independently decided to act. This was a case where the corporation and the government were, for all practical purposes, the same people. Start with the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State under President Dwight Eisenhower. Before entering government, Dulles had been a senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most powerful law firms in New York. Sullivan and Cromwell had represented the United Fruit Company for decades. In fact, it was John Foster Dulles himself who had negotiated the crucial land concessions that gave the United Fruit Company its stranglehold over Guatemala back in the 1930s during the Ubico dictatorship. He personally helped craft the deals that exempted the company from paying taxes for the entire duration of its 90-year lease. Sullivan and Cromwell had been on the United Fruit payroll for 38 years by the time Dulles became Secretary of State. Then there was Allen Dulles, John Foster's brother. Allen Dulles was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Before joining the CIA, Allen had also done legal work for the United Fruit Company through Sullivan and Cromwell. He had sat on United Fruit's board of directors. He owned stock in the company. The man who would order the overthrow of Guatemala's government had a direct financial interest in the corporation that stood to benefit from that overthrow. But the Dulles brothers were not alone. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, John Morse Cabot, came from a family with significant financial interests in the United Fruit Company. Henry Cabot Lodge, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, who would play a key role in deflecting international criticism of the coup, was a large shareholder of United Fruit stock. The connections ran deep, ran wide, and ran right through the heart of the American foreign policy establishment. And so, when the United Fruit Company came to Washington and said that Jacobo Arbenz was a communist who threatened American interests in the Western Hemisphere, the men who heard that message had every reason, financial, personal, and professional, to believe it, or at least to pretend they did. But corporate connections alone might not have been enough to justify overthrowing a democratically elected government. For that, the Eisenhower administration needed a narrative. They needed the American public and the international community to believe that Guatemala was not a small country pursuing modest land reform. They needed people to believe it was a Soviet beachhead in America's backyard, a communist domino about to fall and take the entire Western Hemisphere with it. And for that, they turned to the most dangerous man in American public relations, Edward Bernays. Bernays is often called the father of public relations, but the title dramatically understates what he actually did. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he took his uncle's insights about the subconscious mind and weaponized them for commercial and political purposes. He had already demonstrated his talents by convincing American women to smoke cigarettes by branding them as symbols of feminist liberation. He had helped the American Tobacco Company create fake news bureaus that planted stories favorable to the cigarette industry in newspapers across the country. And now, the United Fruit Company hired him to do the same thing to a sovereign nation. Bernays' strategy in Guatemala was devastatingly simple. He would not try to make the American public care about banana profits. He would not try to explain the intricacies of Guatemalan land reform. Instead, he would make them afraid. He would transform a commercial dispute between a corporation and a government into an existential struggle between freedom and communism. Bernays organized fact-finding trips to Guatemala for American journalists, but these were not genuine investigations. The reporters were flown in on United Fruit's dime, introduced to company employees and hand-picked sources, and fed a pre-packaged narrative of Soviet infiltration 1,000 miles south of New Orleans. The resulting coverage in the New York Times, Time magazine, and the Miami Herald painted Guatemala as a communist state in the making, a puppet of Moscow that threatened the security of the entire hemisphere. United Fruit's public relations department even produced a propaganda film with the extraordinary title of Why the Kremlin Hates Bananas. Bernays also established and operated through a front organization called the Middle America Information Bureau, which, by his own estimate, served 25,000 Americans working in the media. This was not journalism. It was information warfare. And Bernays understood from the very beginning that the audience that mattered was not the Guatemalan public. It was the American public, because the American public was the audience that could authorize a CIA operation. And the campaign worked. By 1953, the narrative that Guatemala was going communist had saturated American media and political discourse. Members of Congress were repeating United Fruit's talking points on the floor. The State Department was issuing warnings about communist infiltration in the Western Hemisphere, and the Eisenhower administration, already staffed with men who had direct financial ties to the United Fruit Company, had all the political cover it needed to act. In August of 1953, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to carry out Operation PB Success, a covert operation whose stated objective was to remove covertly and without bloodshed, if possible, the menace of the communist-controlled government of Guatemala. Alan Dulles, the CIA director who owned United Fruit stock and had sat on its board, established a temporary station codenamed Lincoln in Opa-locka, Florida, to plan and execute the operation. The CIA armed, funded, and trained a force of approximately 480 men, mostly Guatemalan exiles and disaffected military officers, led by a hand-picked figurehead named Carlos Castillo Armas. Castillo Armas was not selected for his military brilliance or his political vision. He was selected because he was anti-communist, pro-American, and willing to do whatever Washington told him to do. But the real weapon of PB Success was not the ragtag rebel army that the CIA assembled. The real weapon was psychological warfare. The CIA understood that it did not need to defeat the Guatemalan military in open combat. It needed to convince the Guatemalan people, and crucially, the Guatemalan military officers, that resistance was futile, that the invasion force was far larger and more powerful than it actually was, and that Arbenz's overthrow was already a foregone conclusion. To accomplish this, the CIA launched one of the most elaborate disinformation campaigns in the history of covert operations. The agency set up a clandestine radio station that broadcast false news reports into Guatemala, claiming that a massive rebel army was advancing on the capital, that military units were defecting to the rebel side, and that the Arbenz government was on the verge of collapse. None of this was true. Castillo Armas's force numbered fewer than 500 men, and they were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. Several of them were carrying dynamite sticks and Molotov cocktails instead of actual bombs because they did not have the payload capacity for proper ordnance. But the broadcast created panic. Guatemalans tuning into their radios heard reports of overwhelming military force bearing down on them, and many believed it. The CIA also made covert contact with church leaders throughout the Guatemalan countryside and persuaded them to incorporate anti-government messages into their sermons. Catholic priests, trusted voices in rural communities, began telling their congregations that the Arbenz government was godless, that land reform was the devil's work, and that good Christians should oppose their own democratically elected president. This was not spontaneous religious conviction. It was a coordinated intelligence operation that exploited the most intimate and trusted relationship in rural Guatemalan life, the relationship between a priest and his flock. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the United States was working to isolate Guatemala diplomatically. At the Organization of American States Conference in Caracas in March of 1954, the US State Department pushed through a resolution condemning the influence of international communism in the Western Hemisphere. Everyone knew this was aimed at Guatemala. The resolution gave Washington a veneer of multilateral legitimacy for what was, in reality, a unilateral act of imperial aggression. On June 18, 1954, the operation began. Castillo Armas's forces crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala. At the same time, CIA-piloted aircraft began bombing military bases and civilian targets in Guatemala City and other population centers. The bombs caused relatively little material damage, but their psychological impact was enormous. Citizens who had been listening to the clandestine radio broadcasts about a massive invasion force now heard explosions overhead and assumed the worst. The government's communications were jammed. False reports of military defections flooded the airwaves. Inside Guatemala City, the situation began to spiral. Arbenz attempted to rally his military. He still commanded a regular army of around 5,000 soldiers and 200 civil guards, a force that vastly outnumbered Castillo Armas's rebels. But the army's officer corps was already wavering. Many of them had been quietly approached by CIA operatives in the weeks and months leading up to the invasion. Some had been bribed, others had been threatened, and all of them had been subjected to the relentless psychological campaign that portrayed the coming coup as inevitable and American-backed. Facing what they believed to be the full might of the United States, the officers refused to fight. They told Arbenz that resistance would only lead to a direct American military intervention, and they pressured him to resign. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, surrendered. In a final radio broadcast before it was jammed, Arbenz addressed his nation. He blamed the United Fruit Company and the American government for his overthrow. He spoke of the land reform that had been his life's work, of the hundreds of thousands of families who had finally received a piece of their own country, and of the forces that had conspired to take it all away. Then he went into exile. He would spend the rest of his life drifting between Mexico, Cuba, France, Czechoslovakia, and Uruguay, a man without a country, broken by the knowledge that the most powerful nation on earth had destroyed his democracy to protect a fruit company's profits. He died in 1971, alone in a bathtub in Mexico City. Some accounts say it was a heart attack. Others have never stopped asking questions. A triumphant CIA cable declared simply, "Success." The human cost was immediate and severe. Over 9,000 Guatemalans suspected of supporting Arbenz, politicians, union leaders, peasant organizers, teachers, anyone who had been associated with the democratic reforms, were arrested in the coup's aftermath. Carlos Castillo Armas assumed the presidency and immediately set about dismantling everything Arbenz had built. He reversed the land reform, returning the expropriated land to the United Fruit Company. He stripped workers of their right to organize. He banned political parties. He burned voter registration lists. He revoked the literacy programs. He shut down the schools. In the space of a few weeks, the 10 years of spring was over, and Guatemala was returned to the darkness from which it had so briefly emerged. Castillo Armas proved to be exactly the kind of leader the CIA had hoped for. Compliant, brutal, and corrupt, he installed a loyal bureaucracy, violently suppressed any remaining opposition, and ensured that American corporate interests were protected above all else. But even this puppet could not hold the strings for long. In 1957, just 3 years after being installed by the CIA, Castillo Armas was assassinated by a member of his own presidential guard. He was replaced by another military government, which was replaced by another, each one more repressive than the last, each one backed by the United States. And then came the Civil War. In 1960, a group of young military officers, some of whom had been trained by the United States, launched an uprising against the military government that had replaced Castillo Armas. The uprising was crushed, but it lit a fuse that would burn for 36 years. The Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996, was one of the most brutal conflicts in Latin American history. Government forces, armed and trained by the United States, carried out systematic atrocities against the civilian population. Entire villages were destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were tortured, raped, or forcibly disappeared. In the early 1980s, the Guatemalan military launched a scorched earth campaign against the indigenous Maya population, burning villages, slaughtering civilians, and destroying crops in what a United Nations Truth Commission would later classify as genocide. 93% of the human rights violations committed during the Civil War were attributed to the US-backed military. The violence was particularly severe during the presidencies of Efraín Ríos Montt and Romeo Lucas Garcia. Historians have drawn a direct line from the 1954 coup to the decades of slaughter that followed, arguing that the overthrow of Arbenz created the political vacuum, the culture of impunity, and the anti-communist paranoia that made the genocide possible. The Civil War ended in 1996 with the signing of peace accords, but not before an estimated 200,000 civilians had been killed and over 1 million displaced. In 1999, US President Bill Clinton traveled to Guatemala and issued a formal apology for America's role in the atrocities committed by the military governments that the CIA had helped install. It was an extraordinary admission, a sitting American president acknowledging that his country had helped create the conditions for genocide. But for the families of the dead, for the survivors of massacres and torture, for the indigenous communities that had been targeted for extermination, an apology was not enough. It could never be enough. And what about the United Fruit Company, the corporation that had started all of this? In the years following the coup, the company continued to operate in Guatemala, but its fortunes were already declining. The very monopolistic practices that had made it so powerful were becoming liabilities. Antitrust scrutiny increased, labor costs rose, competition from other fruit companies intensified. In 1970, the United Fruit Company merged with a meatpacking conglomerate and eventually rebranded itself as Chiquita Brands International. The name changed, but the legacy did not. In 2007, Chiquita pleaded guilty to making payments to a designated terrorist organization in Colombia, the AUC paramilitary group, which had been responsible for widespread human rights abuses. It was yet another chapter in a corporate history defined by the willingness to sacrifice human lives for profit. What makes the Guatemala story so chilling is not just the brutality of what happened, it is the machinery that made it possible. Every element of covert institutional power is visible in its clearest form. A corporation with a commercial grievance, a public relations campaign that reframes that grievance as a national security threat, personnel overlap between the corporation and the government agencies executing the intervention, state violence deployed to protect private revenue, and a public narrative of anti-communism that renders the economic motive invisible. The British South Africa Company of the colonial era used a royal charter to merge corporate and sovereign authority. The United Fruit Company did not need a charter. It had the Dulles brothers, it had Edward Bernays, and it had a CIA willing to overthrow an elected government because a banana company did not want to pay the tax value it had declared on its own filing. There is a profound lesson here about the relationship between power, capital, and democracy, a lesson that echoes far beyond Guatemala and far beyond the 1950s. The coup in Guatemala was not an isolated event, it was a template. It was the second time the CIA had overthrown a democratically elected government, coming just a year after the agency deposed Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in a remarkably similar operation driven by remarkably similar motives. A democratic leader had attempted to reclaim his country's natural resources from a foreign corporation, and the corporation had persuaded the American government to destroy him. After Guatemala, the model was refined and replicated across the globe. The playbook that worked in Tehran and Guatemala City would be adapted for Cuba, for Chile, for Congo, for Indonesia, for Nicaragua. The details changed, the countries changed, the commodities changed, but the fundamental structure remained the same. A government that threatened American corporate interests would be reframed as a communist threat, and the full covert machinery of the United States would be deployed to remove it. The consequences rippled outward in ways that are still being felt today. When people ask why Central America is unstable, when they ask why hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans have fled their country seeking safety and opportunity elsewhere, when they ask why the region struggles with corruption, violence, and poverty, part of the answer lies in a CIA conference room in Opa-locka, Florida, in 1953, where men who had once worked for a banana company decided that a small country's experiment with democracy had to end. In 2011, the Guatemalan government signed an agreement with the surviving family of Jacobo Arbenz. On October 20th of that year, at the National Palace in Guatemala City, Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom formally apologized to Jacobo Arbenz Villanova, the son of the deposed president, for the role the Guatemalan state had played in overthrowing his father. The ceremony included a financial settlement to the family. It was a quiet moment, covered by few international outlets, but it carried the weight of nearly 6 decades of injustice. A country was finally acknowledging that its own government had participated in the destruction of its own democracy at the behest of a foreign power and a foreign corporation. Jacobo Arbenz had wanted to give his people land. He had wanted to build highways and ports that were not owned by a fruit company. He had wanted to transform Guatemala from a feudal colony masquerading as a nation into an actual, functioning capitalist democracy. For that, his government was destroyed, his reforms were reversed, his people were slaughtered, and he died in exile, broken and forgotten. The land went back to the United Fruit Company. The highways were never built. The port was never completed. And Guatemala entered a long night of dictatorship, civil war, and genocide from which it is still struggling to emerge. It is worth remembering that none of this was inevitable. It was a choice. It was a series of choices made by identifiable people with identifiable motives. And those choices, made in the name of fighting communism, but driven by the desire to protect banana profits, shaped the fate of an entire nation for generations. The next time someone tells you that corporations do not control governments, remember Guatemala. Remember the Dulles brothers. Remember Edward Bernays. Remember 480 rebels with dynamite sticks and Molotov cocktails who overthrew a democracy because a company in Boston was asked to pay what its own tax filings said its land was worth. And ask yourself, in an age when corporations have only grown larger, when the revolving door between government and industry spins faster than ever, when public relations has evolved into something Bernays himself could scarcely have imagined, ask yourself honestly, how much has really changed? If you found this story as disturbing and important as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories do not tell themselves, and they certainly do not get easier to research. but they matter. They matter because the patterns repeat. They matter because the people who lived through them deserve to be remembered. And they matter because understanding how power actually works is the first step toward holding it accountable.